In the political landscape of America, particularly during the Trump era, tariffs have been one of the most contentious issues. While the idea of implementing tariffs was sold to the American people as a means of protecting domestic industries and jobs, the reality has turned out to be far different. In fact, these tariffs, particularly the ones imposed by President Donald Trump on goods from China, Canada, and Mexico, have started to bite the very people who were promised protection. Recently, Fox News host Julie Banderas appeared to acknowledge the painful consequences of these tariffs, admitting that they were likely to hurt American consumers, particularly those who supported President Trump. Through her interview with a so-called small business expert, Banderas made a chilling realization. The tariffs are not going to be paid by foreign governments, but by American consumers themselves. In fact, these tariffs are already contributing to inflationary pressures, pushing up the prices of everyday goods like gasoline and groceries, and could even lead to businesses closing their doors. For those who voted for Trump, who believed his promises of prosperity, this realization could prove devastating. Banderas' admission, while seemingly a moment of clarity, exposes the uncomfortable truth. The tariffs aren't just a financial burden. They are a direct blow to the pockets of Trump's own voters. Let's break down how this will impact the American public and why these policies might be doing more harm than good. The promise of tariffs, protecting American jobs or crushing the working class. When Donald Trump first took office, one of his core promises was to bring back jobs to America by imposing tariffs on foreign goods. He argued that such measures would force foreign manufacturers to play by our rules, ultimately making American products more competitive on the global market. But the reality of the situation has been far less rosy than the rhetoric suggested. Trump's administration implemented tariffs across a variety of sectors, most notably targeting China with a 25% tariff on Chinese goods and threatening similar measures on Canadian and Mexican products. The logic was that this would encourage American manufacturers to shift production back home, creating more jobs for American workers. However, Banderas and her guest highlighted a major flaw in this theory. American businesses are heavily reliant on imports, and without cheap goods from abroad, their prices would rise, leading to an increase in consumer costs. In the interview, Julie Banderas was direct when addressing the looming issue of price hikes. She stated that the costs for goods ranging from gasoline to groceries would skyrocket, and while she initially framed this in a more lighthearted tone, the implications of this price inflation are anything but fun. By starting off the conversation with phrases like, "It's going to be a wild ride," Banderas unintentionally minimized the devastating effect that this economic turbulence would have on working-class Americans. Who's paying for these tariffs? The answer is clear. It's the American consumer. Banderas' interview revealed a stark reality. While tariffs were designed to hurt foreign producers, the ones who would feel the pain were not foreign companies. They would be American consumers. As she pointed out, many American companies do not rely on homegrown products, but import cheap goods from countries like China. This means that if these companies are forced to pay higher tariffs, those costs would be passed directly to consumers. In essence, Americans would be paying the price for the tariffs imposed by their own government. Banderas wasn't wrong to recognize this dynamic. The problem is that her tone seemed to downplay the serious consequences. Tariffs are not just an economic inconvenience. They're a serious financial strain on families already struggling with rising costs of living. The problem with, by American sentiments, a risk of price increases and economic uncertainty. Another key issue raised in the interview was the idea of forcing American companies to buy American-made products. While this might sound appealing on the surface, it's not as straightforward as it seems. Banderas' guest warned that, should this Buy American strategy be fully implemented, it could result in even higher costs for goods produced in the U.S. Simply put, manufacturing goods in America is often more expensive than importing them from countries with lower labor costs. Banderas did acknowledge that these cost increases would ultimately be passed on to consumers, but she didn't go further to explore how these higher prices could exacerbate income inequality. By shifting the burden to American families, particularly those who can least afford it. These policies could further undermine the economic well-being of working-class voters, many of whom are Trump supporters. In reality, the Buy American sentiment is a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it encourages domestic production and jobs, but on the other, it risks making everyday goods unaffordable for average consumers. A delicate balance must be struck, one that ensures fair wages for American workers without making products unaffordable. But Trump's tariffs, as implemented, don't seem to achieve that balance. At least, not in the eyes of Banderas and the guest experts. The bigger picture, how tariffs are affecting the broader economy. Beyond individual consumers, the broader economy is also feeling the strain from these tariffs. During the interview, Banderas's guest pointed out that American businesses, which had relied on low-cost imports, were now facing rising prices themselves. As they struggled to absorb these costs, many companies would likely increase their own prices, pushing the cost of goods even higher for American families. But this isn't limited to just foreign imports. Even domestically produced goods have seen price increases, as companies try to remain competitive with imported goods. The net effect? Inflation. Americans are paying more for everything, from food to housing to healthcare, making it even harder for middle-class and low-income families to make ends meet. What's more, businesses struggling to stay afloat may end up cutting jobs or even closing their doors, further exacerbating unemployment rates. The political reality: why Trump's tariffs aren't working the way they were promised. Julie Banderas's realization underscores a crucial point. Trump's trade war with China, Canada, and Mexico has not lived up to its promise. Initially, the tariffs were sold as a way to revitalize American manufacturing and create jobs, but in practice, they have only made it more difficult for American families to make ends meet. In many ways, Banderas's panic reflects the reality that Trump's economic policies have backfired, not just in terms of international relations, but also on the home front. In a politically charged environment, Banderas's moment of clarity was significant because it forced Fox News viewers to confront the uncomfortable truth. The tariffs were not working in their favor. The irony, of course, is that the very people who supported Trump's policies are the ones suffering the most from them. As these costs continue to rise, many Trump voters will likely realize that their faith in his economic agenda was misplaced. Julie Banderas's interview on Fox News may have been a rare moment of truth in a sea of political rhetoric. While it's clear that the Trump administration's tariffs were meant to serve the interests of American workers, the reality is much more complicated. As Banderas admitted, the tariffs have led to higher costs for consumers, particularly in everyday goods like groceries and gasoline. The hope that these measures would revitalize American manufacturing has, in many ways, given way to higher inflation, job cuts, and increased financial insecurity for families across the nation. What's even more concerning is that the very voters who backed Trump's tariffs are the ones bearing the brunt of these policies. Far from protecting American workers, Trump's tariffs seem to be driving up costs and potentially contributing to job losses, making it clear that the promises made during the 2016 campaign were, at best, overly simplistic and, at worst, fundamentally flawed. The lesson here is clear. Trade wars have consequences, and those consequences often fall hardest on the people who can least afford them. As Americans continue to grapple with the rising cost of living, the hope for a more equitable economic future remains distant, and the political ramifications of Trump's tariffs may echo through the 2024 election cycle. It's a harsh reality for many, but Julie Banderas's admission was a reminder that, in the end, the American people will pay the price for these economic policies, whether they realize it or not.